What do How to Train Your Dragon, Shrek, The Godfather, The Dark Knight, Toy Story, and Dune all have in common? The sequels are arguably better than the first movie. Welcome back to my channel, everyone. Today is going to be my first ever non-spoiler review. The entire review is going to be non-spoiler, so don't be concerned if you haven't seen Dune Part 2 yet. I'm not going to spoil it in this video. I will have a separate spoiler review coming out later. I wanted to do this, A, because I got to see the movie early, and B, because I want to see it again before I give my full spoilery thoughts, just so that I make sure that I have it all solid in my head. Because I watched Dune 1 and 1984 Dune in the lead up to going to see Dune Part 2, just so that I made sure I was, A, caught up on this Dune saga, but also I wanted to see what came before and how it's changed, how the story is different, how it's the same, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. So because I'm doing non-spoilers, today I'm going to get into the themes, the characters and actors, some general story structure, the visuals, and the differences I see so far between Dune Part 1 and Dune Part 2, as well as 1984 Dune and this current Dune saga. And then as per usual, I will cap it all off with my rating. Before I get into it, if you would leave a like on this video and subscribe to my channel, that would be amazing. Share this video with your friends, all of your nerdy movie friends who are excited to see Dune, or all of your nerdy book friends who read Dune and are going to judge the movie very harshly and secretly enjoy it. Just share it with people. So first, I want to start off with the themes, because a lot of what I've heard recently from friends, as well as other content creators and other film reviewers about this Dune saga in general, not just the most recent one, but kind of the story of Dune in general, is the issue of having a main character who has a white savior storyline or character arc. And for those who don't know, white savior is typically a white man who comes into this group of typically indigenous or some kind of native people and learns their culture, their ways, and manages to do it better than they do. Oftentimes without any kind of true, there's an appreciation of culture, but it's on a surface level, and it's kind of like this white savior just picks up things easily, things that have taken the indigenous people millennia to come up with and perfect and blah, blah, blah. The white savior picks up in an instant and is like now the leader of this native group of people after having come from who knows where. With Mr. Paul Muad'Dib Atreides, yeah, definitely falls into that category. But what I thought was interesting about this story, specifically Dune Part 2, it doesn't get so much into it in Dune Part 1, because by that time we hadn't met the Fremen, really. But what it is basically, for me anyway, it feels like a lot of Paul's character arc through Dune Part 2 is him kind of trying to push back against that white savior complex idea. Like, there are people who are really gung-ho pushing for him to be this white savior, him to take on this messiah role for the Fremen. And for a big chunk of the movie, he's actively pushing back against that. And then at some point near the end, it kind of switches from him pushing back against it to him not only embracing, but taking advantage of it. So that's kind of getting into some of the things that I can't talk about in non-spoilers in terms of what happens to get him to that place. But that's the arc that I saw, was him starting off in this place of, I know nothing. These are your people. That's your thing. I'm going to let you guys do your thing. I want to learn and I want to just be here with you. I just want to be a part. To at the end him kind of being like, nah, I'm Muad'Dib. Like, I'm Lisan al-Gaib. I'm the Messiah of this group. Like, yeah. I have thoughts that I don't think that I can fully speak on until I see whatever comes next in this saga, because I feel like this arc isn't complete yet. As with Dune Part 1, Dune Part 2 leaves off on a cliffhanger, and I don't feel like Paul's story arc is complete yet, so I don't know if I can fully give my thoughts on that. Maybe I'll try a little bit more when I get into spoilers, when I can talk about some specific things and some reasons why I feel this way or that. I just wanted to bring that up because that's been a big criticism I've seen and heard from people in my life, and is definitely a valid criticism. So if that's a reason for you to be like, nah, I don't want to watch this movie, like, don't watch the movie. You know going into it. I think it's worth a watch anyway. And like I said, I think there's a big discussion to be had, especially considering how Paul's character arc goes in this movie. And taken in the larger context of not all of the characters being white anymore. The main, cast is still white. The Atreides are largely white. The Harkonnens are pretty much all white, I believe. Just something to mention. And then kind of dovetailing from that, there is a lot of South Asian influence in the movie, but not very many, if any, South Asian people being represented. And if they are, definitely not in any meaningful way. There's no South Asian Messiah character, you know what I mean? And a lot of the Fremen are Black. There's some who are Latin or Hispanic as well, which I've found interesting. Again, kind of going back to that, this is a native group of people, this is an indigenous group of people, and they all happen to be, or most of them happen to be, varying shades of brown and Black. So yeah, interesting adding to that conversation, little like addendum to the whole white savior complex conversation. None of these are reasons that I have any strong dislike for the movie. I really enjoyed the movie. I'll get to my rating later. These are just things that I feel are worth mentioning, and it would do a disservice to me as a film reviewer and as a woman of color who has made it a point to accurately and intentionally represent many different cultures in my work. So figured I'd bring it up and open that door, open that conversation as well. And then kind of getting into the characters and actors. Obviously, the whole cast is great. Everybody's great. They all have very distinct roles. When I say that, I mean like the actors play roles that are distinct from other characters that they have played. The most recent thing I've seen Austin Butler in was Elvis. He is nothing like Elvis in this movie. Zendaya is, I think she gets a lot of flack sometimes for playing similar characters. Like a lot of her characters feel like the same person in a different font. I don't know how much I'd agree with that criticism of her work, but this character is, I think, very distinct. I haven't seen Timothée Chalamet in a whole lot, but again, this character, there are moments where it's kind of just you're watching the character and you forget that it's acting, which is good. But then there were a few scenes, and I think that I picked up on this because I'm an actor. There were a few moments that I was like, ooh, that was okay acting. Like that was a a little moment there. I see you, Timothy. So it was really cool to just sit. It's such a movie to experience, like, and from so many different areas, from, you know, the visuals and the score and the acting. There's just so much to like soak in. So for film people, Dune 1 I went to see with several of my film nerd friends, and I so missed having them there going to see this one to be able to talk to, because like after I left Dune Part 1, we were all like talking and, you know, giving our thoughts, our immediate like mind-blown reactions, and then, you know, continued to talk about it days later. And I didn't get to, none of my friends have seen it yet, because at the time of recording this, it's not out publicly, and I didn't have them with me. So I was like, ugh. And as I came out of the theater, I saw other groups of people with their friends and like chatting, and I'm like, ugh, I miss my people. The acting was something to behold. What I will say about this movie as opposed to Dune Part 1 is, even though Paul is still the main character and a driving force in the story, this is a less Paul-centric movie than Dune Part 1. Like, Dune Part 1 was kind of purely from Paul's standpoint, and we are in his POV for the bulk of the movie. And even when we're not with him, we are seeing and hearing how things are affecting him. The things that are happening have a direct connection to him and the things that he's doing. In this movie, we kind of take a step back and look at things from a wider galaxy universe view. So there's a lot more like different planetary relations going on. There's some more with the Bene Gesserit going on. There's a whole sequence with the Harkonnens that's like purely them and their culture, and has nothing to do with Paul. And then even with the Fremen, there's a lot of focus on Chani, which they kind of set up in interviews and stuff after Dune Part 1. They were like, okay, Zendaya's going to be a bigger role, and Chani's going to take a bigger role in Part 2 and Part 3. She definitely did, and I think that her character throughout the story was my favorite, just because of the way that she operates in the world, the way that she interacts with other characters, both those Outworlders, Paul and Jessica, and the Fremen, and how she is a leader amongst her people, the Fedaykin, the warriors, but she chooses not to take a position of power. Like, she is very much no tall puppies. We're all even here. There's nobody she doesn't see people as greater or lesser than others. So she pushes really, really hard back against this whole Paul being Muad'Dib, Paul being the Messiah, not necessarily Muad'Dib, but for the Fremen, Muad'Dib kind of becomes synonymous with Messiah. And she's not here for it. She's not here for it. She loves her man, but she's standing on business. She's like, nope, I'm not about it. So if you're going to be about it, that's not going to work for me, bestie. Sorry. And that stuff kind of happens towards the end. It's a little more spoilery. So I'll discuss that in my spoiler review. But before I leave Chani specifically, the way that the movie leaves off, it's kind of setting her up as the protagonist that we're following. Like, it leaves off on a cliffhanger, and Paul has a lot to do with that cliffhanger, but I'm more interested to see what Chani does next in the next movie. Not that I'm not interested in seeing what Paul is doing. It's just Chani's story and her arc, the way that it ended at the end, holds more pull for me right now. Javier Bardem, beautiful. Stilgar, great. This movie was funnier than the last one, I think. And I think a lot of that is due to Stilgar, not him being comic relief and like he's a jokey jokes all the time kind of guy, but he's just a very matter-of-fact. I feel like I've said this about another character in another review. Maybe Reacher. Yeah. But he's just a very, like, matter-of-fact kind of dude. He says stuff, and the delivery is funny, and I think that's intentional on Javier Bardem's part. But I don't think the character himself is always intending to be funny. He's just like, the timing is excellent. It's wonderful.
Shai Hulud decides today if you become Fremen, or if you die.
In Dune Part 1, you wouldn't kind of see him as the religious fanatic, but in Dune Part 2, there's a little more of that kind of revealed in him. And it's not so much that he's like crazy as much as it is he starts seeing things and having confirmation bias. And so that just gets the snowball rolling, which I think creates a very interesting tension between him and Chani, because it kind of feels like after Jamis, spoilers for Dune Part 1, after Jamis died in Dune Part 1, Chani was kind of next in line as his second in command. And this whole to be or to not be religious, to believe or to not believe in Lisan al-Gaib, that is a big, big sticking point for Chani and just Chani in general, but specifically for Chani and Stilgar. Jessica, Paul's mom, has a lot more agency and influence in the way that the story goes than I would have expected. It's a good thing, you know, she wasn't just kind of like there. She disappears from screen a little more in this movie, but I don't think there's ever a moment where her influence is gone. She sets the ball in motion for some things and continues on some things that kind of keep her around even when she's not on screen or even when she's not directly a part of whatever's happening at that moment. And her and another character who is maybe supposed to be a surprise, so I won't mention it here, but because this person was on all of the red carpets, I think it kind of undercuts the surprise a little bit. If you're not paying attention for it, then you'll probably be like, oh, I forgot such and such was supposed to be in this movie. But I heard, speaking of people leaving the theater, I heard somebody afterward being like, well, yeah, when such and such showed up, I was not surprised because like they were at all the red carpets and in the interviews and blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, oh, okay. So, you know, me coming in and not having a huge, like, I haven't read any of the Dune books. I wasn't expecting this character, to be this character. Like, I expected this actor to show up, but not this particular character. So it was a surprise for me. But that, just heads up, if you want to go in and be surprised, just don't maybe watch all of the press interviews. Maybe. Fade Radha, Austin Butler's character, was amazing and wonderful and psychopathic and insane, and I loved every second of it. Every second he was on screen was amazing. The Harkonnen sequence on their planet is a really cool, like, visual sequence because they, I guess, have a black sun or something, so it makes everything black and white. And because they're already like super pale, you're like, oh, is it just them being super pale? And everybody's super pale, so it looks black and white. But you see like the transition of like, okay, you see some color, and then it's like, no, we're flat, black and white. And there's a really cool sequence that takes place on the Harkonnen planet, and he's the center of it, and it's great. There's a lot to his character that I think ties very closely in with the Baron, but I think that this saga wasn't as explicit about as Dune 1984. There's a relationship between him and the Baron that is away, and I don't think that that's made as expressly clear in this version of the story. And I think that's okay. I actually kind of prefer it this way, because there's a little more nuance to it and a little more room for people to kind of explore it, as opposed to it having been laid out for them, which I'll come back to that because that's a common theme for Dune 1984 for me. That being said, with Austin Butler's character, Feyd-Rautha, because of where his character leaves off at the end of this movie, I kind of wish that he was maybe in the first movie a little bit, at least introduced in the first movie, because there's some character relations that I think could have been a little stronger or introed a little bit earlier in order to flesh out the way his character arc goes in this movie. And it's not so much an arc, he kind of is the same person he was at the beginning of the movie, but he goes through some back and forth with some different people, and some things change for him and in terms of status and such, that I think would have been cool to see what his relationships to some of the other characters, some of the main characters, was prior to this movie. All that to say, basically, I wanted more Austin Butler, which he's great, so duh. Florence Pugh as Princess Irulan. She's amazing in everything. Love Florence Pugh to death. Much, much, much prefer her characterization in this movie than in Dune 1984, which is made in the 80s, like product of the times, but all of the female characters are just there. And it feels like especially her. Even though she intros, like she narrates Dune 1984, it just feels like she's there. You know, she shows up in the background of one of the scenes and does not say a word. And you're like, who's that? Oh, okay. I'm supposed to remember her from that couple minutes her face was like going in and out of screen in the beginning when she was narrating. Okay. And I think there's an interesting story that I don't recall being in Dune 1984 that connects her with Jessica and some of the other Bene Gesserit in a different way than I would have expected. That also, I think, sets up some pretty potentially cool stuff for the third movie. Back to the Harkonnens, the Baron is exceptionally disturbing, as intended. Stellan Skarsgård, I don't even know what to say. I hate every moment that he's on screen, and I think I'm intended to. Like, the Baron is not a character that you want to like. Feyd-Rautha, a part of me kind of wants to like him. Again, there's some story stuff and some backstory stuff that is kind of teased, that makes me want. I have a soft spot for him. The Baron, no, at all. He's terrifying and horrible and disgusting and incredibly disturbing, but that's how he should be. And Stellan Skarsgård played it very, very well. Played it to a T. The Emperor is less conniving than I expected, given he put the whole events of the first movie into motion and is involved in some of the events of this movie as well. Much less conniving than I expected. I am almost wondering if maybe he is not as powerful as everyone else believes that he is, or at least that he wants everyone to believe he is. I think there are some strings that can be pulled that he doesn't want people to know about, and honestly, I'm not sure that he is fully aware of them, because there's a moment where it kind of feels like he has some, not remorse, but he feels guilty about being responsible, indirectly, for Duke Leto Atreides' death. And sorry, spoilers for Dune 1, but he continues on the path that he's on. So even though he seems like, ooh, I might not feel great about that, he keeps on trucking. All the Fremen were great. I really enjoyed getting to spend a lot of the movie with them. They all had very large personalities, at least the ones that we focused on. Not all of them got a lot of play, but the ones that did had very, very fun personalities. And I think that kind of contributed to the somewhat lighter moments, the funnier moments with Stilgar and such. There was an interesting tension between, there's like tribal tension among the Fremen between the northern and southern tribes, specifically around this whole Fremen religion and the belief in Lisan al-Gaib and the Messiah of the Quetzalcoatl. Don't sue me, I probably pronounced that wrong. But this Messiah figure, there are very distinct factions of people who believe in it and who don't. And it's interesting to kind of have that as a conflict in the story, because the Fremen are kind of presented, especially in Dune 1 in 1984, they're presented as this single unit, kind of this, like, not hive mind necessarily, but like they all kind of follow the pecking order. Like there's this one guy and everybody else follows that person. And then Paul Atreides comes in and shakes things up. But there's already distinctions in the Fremen tribe that are separate from Paul himself, that are kind of exacerbated by his presence because of who some of them believe him to be. But it's already there. And part of the story is that tension and that fire kind of being stoked by some of the characters. As it pertains to visuals, breathtaking, gorgeous, leagues and leagues ahead of 1984. You know, it's the 80s, man. You know, gotta give them some credit. There's some decent looking scenes in that movie. And there's some really, really hard to watch scenes in that movie. Like I said, with the whole black and white sequence on the Harkonnen planet, it's really, really striking. And I really enjoyed that sequence. And it's different, like Thor, Love and Thunder did a similar thing where there's a black and white sequence, but it feels different than this. This felt natural. In a different way, and it wasn't like cut to, or there's certain things that are, you know, color among the black and white world. It's like there's an in-story reason for this transition to black and white, and it's not just the whole planet's black and white. It's specifically when you're under the sun. Inside, people are all, as you know, they're pale and pasty as ever, but they're in color inside buildings on the Harkonnen planet. But outside, under the sun, they're all black and white, which it just was a really cool visual sequence. And then all of the vast expanses of sand and all of that are gorgeous. The sandworms are excellent, amazing looking, terrifying, but there's some more detail that we get with them in this movie because we see them up close multiple times. There's a really cool spaceship and some visuals that play off the spaceship with reflections and such later in the movie that I really enjoyed. But yeah, visuals were 10 out of 10. There's not much to say there. The expectation was set high with Dune Part 1, and Dune Part 2 delivered completely. There were some shots that kind of reminded me of Oppenheimer with some of the shots of like the chemical reactions happening. There's some shots that are similar to that reminded me of that in this movie. I think it's just recency bias. That's why I jumped to that, because there are similar-ish scenes in Dune 1984 but the closest visual comparison I can make right now is to Oppenheimer in those specific scenes, which were really great to look at. And then my big to-do about the differences between Dune Part 1 and Part 2, and then this Dune saga and 1984. Looping back to what I was saying earlier, 1984 does a really weird thing where they kind of handhold you through some pretty self-explanatory things, over-explaining little details or harping on specific points in the story, specific things people said. They'll have something said in the or shown in the scene, and then characters will literally like explain it again in their inner voices. And then there are other times where they just kind of stuff happens and you're like, what, where, how do we, that's where I needed the exposition. That's where I needed the extra help understanding. You didn't have to explain this thing to me that you've already clearly shown me or already explained, but that over there. And it was, it makes for a hard to follow story. Which is interesting because the story of Dune 1 and 2, like Dune 1984, is pretty much like the story of both Dune 1 and 2 kind of fit in 1984. So basically they shoved a lot of story into 1984. And there are some direct lines from the original and this new Dune saga. Line delivery, I think there are some lines where it's like, oh, okay, those are on par. They just are said with a different characterization because these actors had different, they picked different actions for their characters than our current cast has for their characters. And then there's some lines where it's like, whew, thank goodness for this new saga. Yeah, they did too much. They tried to shove too much in and got a little lore heavy in areas where it not only didn't need it, but never was touched on again. So it's like, why are you introducing this big giant weird monster in the first 15 minutes of the movie that never comes back again? Like, what is happening here? Dune 2 is kind of a more complete story on its own. Like I said, it still ends with a cliffhanger, but from beginning to end, it feels more like okay, this is, I can see a clear start and a clear cutoff. Not necessarily an end because the story is not over, but at the end of Dune 1, it was like, it just stopped. To me, it felt like, rewatching it especially, it felt like, okay, we have this thing that we're like starting to go on. This thing has happened and we've gotten to our sort of our goal of, in that movie, it was getting to the Fremen people. And it kind of just ends there. And this movie picks up with that and then carries it on to its ending. In retrospect, Dune 1 was a prologue, and this is kind of the first and second act of the Dune saga. Dune 1 was a pretty great prologue. Like, I appreciate that it delved into House Atreides. Like, that was a solely House Atreides movie. And this movie is a Fremen movie, really. In addition to being that, it pulls back and, like I said earlier, starts to interplay with some of that planetary relations kind of story. And we now see where the Atreides and the Fremen are in this grander scale. It's not just, okay, we are Atreides and we are here and we are being besieged, we're being attacked. It's like, okay, they now have agency. Now we're getting used to Arrakis and we're starting to talk about the Harkonnens and we're seeing where the Emperor is at and all of these little things that start to bring in that lore and tie it together. But because we had Dune 1 to kind of give us a foundation of, okay, these are the people we're dealing with, without having all of that lore heavy stuff shoved at us all at once, the reason that I think that Dune 2 is arguably a better movie than Dune 1 is intrinsically tied to Dune 1 being a perfect setup. Like, without the setup of Dune 1, I don't think this movie would have been as successful of a Dune story. It's still a great movie in and of itself, but it relies heavily on what came before with intention. And so it flows like we're on an upward swing in the Dune saga, which I love. I am really interested to see, once it all comes out on streaming, to be able to watch them back to back and see how I feel about the whole shebang. I am ready to give you my final thoughts and my rating. Final thoughts. I'm not quite sure where Paul's motivation is right now, and I'm not sure that I trust his trajectory. It feels almost like there could be something that he's holding back. I can't talk about it specifically yet because it's very spoiler heavy, but I will talk about in detail my thoughts on that and why I feel that way in my spoiler review. But I know his motivation has changed from the beginning of the movie. I'm just not sure if it's an honest change in motivation or if it's surface level. And if I'm to blame this change in motivation on external circumstances that happened in the movie. Again, loved Chani's story. Super excited to see what happens with her in part 3, and in relation to the Fremen, in relation to Paul, and the whole conflict. I'm interested to see if she will be forced to take on a leadership role, not so much as like she is now a warrior leader, but a kind of leader to combat Paul. I'm not sure. Again, I haven't read the book, so I don't know what the story is next. So I'm excited to see where it goes. There's a lot of ways that I think it can play out, specifically with her character, and I'm excited to see Zendaya get to chew on some more good material. I haven't left a movie this speechless since I saw Dune 1. Like, I genuinely got in my car and like laughed at how speechless I was. Like, I didn't know what to say. What I remember feeling was, this is why I got into this business. Like, this is the kind of feeling that I want people to have when they see my movies. I want people to leave and be like, I'm just so overwhelmed with goodness, and like, this thing was amazing, and this thing was amazing, and the story was amazing, and the actors were amazing, and the visuals were amazing. And it's just like, the way that movie made me feel coming out of it just cemented that I am in the right industry. I love what I do, and that's why I love it, because it has that effect on people. It has that effect on me, and I'm sure I'm not the only person. I'm sure it's not just movie people who feel that way. I'm sure there are plenty of people who have not a care in the world for the behind the scenes production of a movie, but appreciate the movie in the same way just because it's such a great movie. So I would have to give it a 9 out of 10. I am going to reserve my potential 10 out of 10 for seeing the movie again, because I want to see it. I want to have some time away from it, some space to breathe, and then go see it again and see if I still feel the same way, if I've picked up anything new, any more critiques or more praises for the movie. And then I will maybe update that rating in my spoiler review, or maybe I'll leave it the same. Who knows? But yeah, thank you for joining me on this wonderful ride. I'm not gonna lie, it's a little hard for me to do non-spoiler. So thank you for sticking through this, and I hope that I didn't give you any more information than you would have liked to know. I'm hoping that if you're seeing this movie, in watching this video before you see this movie that you at least have seen Dune Part 1, because I did spoil some parts of Dune Part 1. Again, thank you for joining me. Please leave a like on this video, comment what you're excited about for Dune Part 3, or any thoughts that you have about Dune Part 1 and Dune Part 2. And also, if you've seen Dune 1984, like if you saw it when it was in theaters way back when, please let me know. I was talking to some people at my job who did see it in 1984, and apparently some of them then felt it was so bad that they left the theater at that moment, like as kids. So I'm like super curious to see how people feel about that movie who have seen it and in retrospect. Like, it's a very campy movie, so I'm curious to know if it's kind of crossed over into that cult classic kind of area, or if it's still like, no, we don't need to talk about that one. We got the new ones, don't worry about it. So yeah, leave your thoughts below. Subscribe to my channel. If you'd like to see some more of my movie reviews, you can click right up here. And if you'd like to see any of my other work, any of my short films, or I don't know, whatever pops up, you'll see it. Click right down here. And I will see you in the next one.